to introduce tonight's speaker. Don Rightmeyer is going to present for us Kentucky's Bookends to the Civil War, and specifically Major Robert Anderson of Fort Sumter. Now, Don currently works at the Mercer County Public Library in Harrodsburg. He lives with his lovely wife in Danville. He's a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he majored in military history, and he served in various flying and staff appointments around the world during his more than 20-year Air Force career. More recently, Don was editor of the Kentucky Historical Society's genealogy quarterly entitled Kentucky Ancestors. I'm sure you've seen copies of that booklet around. He's an expert in the subject of immigration into Kentucky during the 19th century, or is that 18th century? Both, yeah, all the people who came into Kentucky, as well as the effects of the Civil War in Kentucky. He's been a featured speaker at the Northern Kentucky Regional History Day over at NKU that we have every year, and he's spoken at numerous libraries around the Commonwealth, as well as other county historical societies. In fact, Steve and I were reminiscing, we saw Don at the Grant County Historical Society. Oh, it's been a couple years back. But so please join me in expressing our deep appreciation to Don Rightmeyer for coming.
Let me first of all say what a real honor it is to be invited to come back to the Boone County Historical Society. I always love to go anywhere that someone's, I should say, foolish enough to invite me to come speak on a particular topic, and it's certainly an honor if you get invited back. I will have to say to you, I'm very envious of those of you that live here in Boone County. This library, for one thing, has a tremendous local history and genealogy collection. You guys are very blessed with that. This historical society is outstanding. I'm no longer a staff person at the Kentucky Historical Society, but I have to say, as a Kentuckian, as someone who's long loved local history and genealogy, you guys have a real treasure, and certainly appreciate Betsy and Steve Conrad and other members of your Historical Society board, and I appreciate all of you being here tonight. I will try to provide time at the end for questions if you have any. I hope that you'll find this talk interesting. How many of you know who Robert Anderson, Major Robert Anderson of Fort Sumter was? Okay, how many of you really don't know? But you will hopefully by the end of the evening. Okay, well, I hope that you will find that this gentleman was a very special person. I have to say, if you've ever heard the question, who would you like to sit down and enjoy a meal with? In coming to study about Robert Anderson and his life experience, he is one guy that I would love to have that opportunity. Now, I turned 65 in June, so when the centennial of the Civil War, back beginning in 1961, started, I had heard of Major Robert Anderson and Fort Sumter and the part that played in the beginning of the Civil War. And I'm somewhat embarrassed to admit to you, as Betsy mentioned, when I worked at the Kentucky Historical Society from 2007 through 2013, that the magazine that I was editing, Kentucky Ancestors, led me to look more deeply in that Robert Anderson, and I actually did not realize that he was a native Kentuckian until I began that research maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I think as we go through this talk tonight, you're going to find a lot of very other interesting things. I hope that you will find it kind of fuel for learning more about your own predecessors here in Boone County and perhaps areas that you grew up in. So another thing, people might be puzzling, what does Kentucky's Bookends to the Civil War mean? I think you'll get a full grasp of that by the time I finish. But you know, bookends generally have two pieces. One goes on one end of the books and one goes on the other. And I think by the time we finish, you'll see why I refer to Major Robert Anderson as Kentucky's bookends to the Civil War. Now, Robert Anderson, this is a portrait of him that actually hangs in the dining hall at the United States Military Academy at West Point. You probably more commonly have heard of it referred to as West Point. It's where now young men and women go to be trained for 4 years. It began back in 1802, and during the course of the many, many years since then, the buildings have certainly increased and grown, but at some point after Robert Anderson went through his life career in the Army, this portrait was donated to the Academy, and it actually hangs there as one of many. It's a point of inspiration for the young people that are going through there and will hopefully pursue a career in the United States Army. As you see, Robert Anderson was a son of Virginia, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. As I mentioned, he was a native Kentuckian. He was born on the soil of Kentucky, and he spent literally his entire adult life as a soldier for the United States, and he certainly was an American. And I hope that you'll find the details and the path that Robert Anderson took during his Army career interesting. This is an image of his father. His father's name was Richard Clough Anderson. That's how you pronounce C-L-O-U-G-H, Clough. He was a native Virginian, and as we point out here, Robert Anderson's mother was actually Richard Clough Anderson's second wife. His first wife was the sister of George Rogers Clark and William Clark of the famous Lewis and Clark expedition. She had 4 children. She then passed away, and then his dad married Sarah Marshall, who was a cousin of John Marshall, who was one of the chief justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. So, as you can see, Robert Anderson had 4 half-siblings, and then he was actually one of 12 of his mom, Sarah Marshall Anderson. Now, I have yet to find proof of this, but notice what Robert Anderson's birthday is. And then we're going to think about, by the time we finish tonight, some aspects of his life that have become very prominent. Notice his birthday is on 14 June. That happens to be Flag Day. I can't find any connection that proves that his birthday is also the reason Flag Day is on that date, but you make your own decision by the time we finish tonight. Anyway, he was born in 1805. His father actually had built a small, rather modest home, and then he built a considerably larger one, and he referred to it as Soldier's Retreat, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, his dad was born in 1750 in a small community in Virginia called Gold Mine, and it was in Hanover County at that time. He actually supposedly was in Boston when the Boston Tea Party took place. He was a young man, and when the Revolutionary War began, Robert Clough Anderson joined one of the Virginia line units and served on active duty and fought in several battles, as you see there, during the course of the Revolutionary War. He was at the Battle of Trenton, Savannah. Interestingly, he was stationed at Charleston and Fort Moultrie, which we're going to hear about again a couple of times, and he was actually present at Yorktown. One of the really neat things about his life is the fact that he served as a member of the staff of the Frenchman and aristocrat, the Marquis de Lafayette, when he came and brought much of the support and influence of France to our battle against England. And some years after the Revolutionary War was over, the Marquis de Lafayette made a sort of a victory tour back to the United States. He was an older man by that point in time. But you know how when a celebrity is around, and I think mentioning the fact that the Pope's coming to the United States, people like to be seen in the presence of that celebrity, and so they hope that the little glory will reflect on them. So I'm sure there were a lot of people that wanted to be seen in the presence of the Marquis de Lafayette. But interestingly, it's reported that when Marquis de Lafayette and Richard Clough Anderson saw each other, they actually ran and embraced each other as old comrades from the Revolutionary War together. And I can just imagine many of the people that were there that day were green with envy that Richard Clough Anderson had this kind of familiarity and brotherhood with the Marquis. Anderson had a real burden and a real desire to care for those that had fought for the colonies and had achieved the freedom of the colonies from England. And that would be a lifelong thing. And so when he built his home in what would be present-day Jefferson County, Kentucky, he actually named it Soldier's Retreat. Now, this is one of the Kentucky historical markers that was placed there several years ago to commemorate that. There is actually today a reproduction. There's not the present occupants, but a previous one actually did the archaeological study and rebuilt the house. And the house is quite impressive, considering that it was actually built in the late 1700s at the site where this historical marker is. But he named it Soldier's Retreat. And if you think about those two words, it really exemplified the desire that Richard Clough Anderson, Robert Anderson's father, had to care for and to just share comradeship with those that he had shared camp life and battle during the Revolutionary War. The home was pretty much open to anyone that wanted to drop by. They could be assured of a warm meal. They probably were also given a place to spend the night. Perhaps they were making their way further west to find a place to live. Richard Clough Anderson was so well known that his compatriots from the Revolutionary War actually voted for him to be the Virginia representative for doling out land to the veterans of Virginia that had fought during the Revolutionary War. You probably know that, of course, at that point in time, present-day Kentucky was actually part of Virginia. And so those that fought for Virginia during the Revolutionary War were able to get land either in our state today of Kentucky or actually up in Ohio. Those were two areas where land would be given. And it was given to those who had served, and it was given in an amount commensurate with their rank during the Revolutionary War. You'll notice also there were other very well-known people that passed through and visited at Soldier's Retreat. President Monroe was one, Andrew Jackson, and nearby Jefferson County neighbor Zachary Taylor. And of course, you all recognize that those are three, either at that time contemporary or future presidents of the United States. So, young Robert Anderson had a lot of very interesting things going on in his home as he was growing up there, since he was born in 1805. In 1821, July of 1821, he actually got an appointment to the United States Military Academy. He was only 16 years old, which perhaps is not that unusual for that time. That would be a bit young today to gain entry to one of the military academies. I think you have to be at least 17 or perhaps even 18 years old. I actually was 19 when I entered the Air Force Academy because I had to go to Georgetown College for a year and study calculus so I wouldn't flunk out math. And I'm glad I did that because it ensured that through even a lot of hard study after that, I was able to graduate and serve in the Air Force. He graduated in 1825 as a member of that class, and he was 15th out of 37. So you can see he was about halfway in that class. And the rank he had in the class made a determination on what branch of the Army he would serve in. It was basically the cavalry, the infantry, the artillery, or the Corps of Engineers. West Point was the first engineering university or college in the United States, and that was the most desired field for people to go into. The second one was generally the cavalry, the third was artillery, and the fourth was infantry. That was the cadets' desire. So many of the cadets didn't want to be in the infantry, but their grades were such that that was what they had to do. And I'll tell you a little bit about how Robert Anderson turned out in just a minute. I found it very interesting that he was only the 8th young Kentucky man to graduate from West Point. Actually, when the academy began, I think the first graduating class had 2 members. And it was in its very early stages, and it gradually developed, and they developed a curriculum. And so he was the 8th young man from this state to enter the academy and actually graduate. Did you notice there he was commissioned a lieutenant of artillery and the 3rd Artillery? And there's some interesting guys that were there at the academy during the same 4 years that he was there. Notice in the class of 1828, this gentleman would have been a freshman when Anderson was a senior. It was a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis, who I'm sure you all have heard of. Another one who graduated a year after Anderson was Albert Sidney Johnston. He was actually born up at Old Washington, up northeast of here. And he was in the class of 26. Edmund Kirby Smith was one of the Confederate generals who led the invasion of Kentucky in 1862, coming up through the Cumberland Gap in that area. And Leonidas Polk, you've probably heard of. He was one of the generals that served at the Battle of Perry, where he actually graduated from West Point, served in the Army, and then got out and became an Episcopal bishop. And that's what he was doing when the Civil War broke out. So these are just a few of the perhaps prominent names of some people during the Civil War that you may have heard of who were there at West Point with Robert Anderson. Anderson, one of his 4 half-siblings was a brother by the name of Richard Clough Anderson, Jr., and he actually served in the Kentucky legislature, served 2 terms in the U.S. Congress, and was as you see there, then sent to be the first envoy to Columbia in the early 1800s. And so the first, if you will, assignment that Robert Anderson got when he graduated from West Point was to accompany his brother to Columbia and South America, and that's what he did as soon as he graduated from West Point. Unfortunately, Richard Clough Anderson Jr. was stricken down very suddenly by illness and actually died as they were traveling en route to a large conference that was going to be held. So 1 year after his death, the Kentucky legislature actually carved out and named after him Anderson County, which the county seat, as you probably know, is Lawrenceburg. So that's the Anderson that Anderson County was named after. But with the death of his brother, Robert Anderson basically returned back to the normal channels of assignments within the Army. And the first place he went to was Fort Monroe, which is there just on the peninsula of Virginia, just southeast of Hampton, if you've ever been in that area. That's where you went to get your beginning instruction and knowledge about being an artilleryman in the Army. In 1832, as you see, he fought in the Black Hawk War, which was a war with the Black Hawk and the Sauk Indians up in Illinois. And he and that Lieutenant Jefferson Davis were actually sent and commissioned as colonels because some of the Illinois militia men didn't have any respect for their own militia officers. So Anderson and Jefferson Davis, who were both very junior officers, were actually made colonels in the Illinois militia. And Robert Anderson was actually the one who mustered in a young man by the name of Abraham Lincoln, who was an Illinois militiaman, and then mustered him out when this particular conflict was over. In 1835 through 37, he was asked to return to West Point to serve as an instructor of artillery. And notice there some of the, again, prominent names that you probably have seen or read about who were cadets under him while Anderson was there as an instructor. A young man, and his PGT stands for Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard, Philip Sheridan, George H. Thomas, who during the Civil War was known as the Rock of Chickamauga, and there are several other noted Civil War leaders. In fact, Beauregard actually considered Anderson his favorite instructor while he was a cadet at West Point. I'm going to make some comments about that a little bit later. In 1837-38, Robert Anderson was participated in the Seminole Wars, which was conflict between the U.S. Army and the Seminole Indians in the Florida area. And he served down there. And then in 1846, the United States, of course, was involved in the Mexican War. U.S. Army men were sent down to Mexico to fight that war with them. And he was actually wounded there. He was severely wounded in the chest and evacuated back to the United States following his injury in battle there. In 1845, Robert had married this lady that you see on the left there. That is Eliza Bayard Clinch. She was known as Eva, sort of a combination of her first and middle names. Bayard was a family name, and so she was referred to throughout most of her life as Eva. At the time he went to the Mexican War, they didn't have children, but as you see there, they subsequently had 4 children. The little boy there is actually Robert. He was the youngest. And she pretty much was an invalid throughout most of her married life with Robert. Throughout many of the years that he was actually serving in the Army, she was back in New York. Her father, as you see there, was a veteran of the War of 1812 and also saw action in the Seminole War, and he had been a member of Congress. And he was a slave owner. He was from Georgia, and there's some misinformation that's been published in a lot of books about Robert Anderson that he was a slave owner, but actually in truth, his wife was the one that owned the slaves because they had been given to her by her father. So he was not a slave owner. Robert Anderson was not. But they did have some slaves, if you will, between them in their married life. And that led to some very wrong assumptions on the part of senior leadership in this country when it came time for the Civil War. A few years later, in the hometown where I grew up, Harrodsburg, Kentucky, we see the sort of thought pattern and the desires of Robert Anderson's father put into action. There was actually this is an amazing drawing. When I found this several years ago, there is no building of this size or magnitude in Harrodsburg today. And when I saw it, I was like, man, what a structure this was. Well, this was what was known back in the early 1800s as medicinal springs. There were several of these throughout Kentucky, and this one was located in Harrodsburg. It was actually sold off by its owner, and the U.S. government bought it and turned it into a home for soldiers. And the man who was sent there to be the superintendent of this particular, what they call the Western Military Asylum, was Robert Anderson. And unfortunately, as was very common back in the early 1900s, and of course even happens today, some of the buildings caught fire, and so they had to make a decision, and rather than reconstructing them, they sent them to what would be present-day U.S. soldiers and sailors' home in Washington, D.C. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. I would flash up to the beginning of the Civil War. And so Charleston obviously is a very intense hotbed of some of the blooming secession feelings that are going on in the United States. And of course, you all are familiar with the fact that as the election took place in November, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. And then on 20 December, the state of South Carolina decided to secede from the Union. Well, sometime prior to that, the commander at Fort Sumter was a Lieutenant Colonel Gardner. And if you think anything about the coastal fortifications of the United States, they were never intended to defend against attack from the land. They were always built with the intent of defending against seaborne attack against the United States. And that's why Fort Moultrie, why another place there called Castle Pinckney, and then eventually Fort Sumter were built so that they could protect Charleston Bay and Charleston Harbor from any offensive attack by any country that might try to shut down our shipping and seize that major part of the southeast maritime commerce of the United States. Well, they had their armory where they kept the powder and the rifles and all that on actual mainland there in Charleston. So when the secession crisis began to develop, Colonel Gardner sent some men to go get some of this. And by that point, in late 1860, there were such sentiments developing between the federal government and South Carolina that there was a lot of they came very close to actually having armed fighting. Colonel Gardner was summarily removed from command, and because they knew that Anderson was a Southerner, since he was born here in Kentucky, he was considered a Southerner. Some thought he was a slave owner. They thought they could send him down there as the commander of Fort Sumter, and he would deal with southern states in a way that would keep anything from happening. So Anderson showed up. I'm going to show you some pictures of those that were serving with him and that sort of thing. But surprisingly, on December 26, 1860, Anderson made the decision to move all of his men from Fort Moultrie out to Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter had been under construction for quite some years. It was a 3-story structure, and I'll show you a picture of it in just a moment. Fort Moultrie, that they were actually in and functioning in, had become in such disrepair that it was the sand dunes had blown up to the side of the fort such that cows could actually walk into the fort by walking up the sand dunes. So Robert Anderson realized that, yes, a potential threat is not coming from the sea. It's probably going to come from Charleston and the other surrounding land. So he felt it important that they move their men and their ammunition and what supplies they had out to Fort Sumter, which to that point had not been occupied at all. And if you'll notice there, this, at the very bottom of this slide is the message to the Department of War that Robert Anderson sent as soon as they had moved the men out to Fort Sumter. They did it during the dark of night. At that point, actually South Carolina forces were already patrolling Charleston Harbor to try to keep an eye on the U.S. Army forces there under Anderson's command. And they were actually able to get out to the fort with what they were able to move in some small boats. He sent this message. He said, "The step which I have taken was, in my opinion, necessary to prevent the effusion of blood." Robert Anderson, it's definitely safe to say, feared that this country was heading for a very tragic civil war, which of course now we know he was exactly on the mark. And he felt that by moving his command from Fort Moultrie out to Fort Sumter, perhaps he could be some part of preventing what he thought was going to become a very bloody and tragic event in the history of the country. I'd like to show this slide. I don't know that a lot of people realize this, but there are 3 prominent Kentuckians at the beginning of the Civil War. One of those is, of course, as we know, Abraham Lincoln, who we just celebrated the bicentennial of his birthday a few years ago in 2009. The second one was Jefferson Davis, who has obviously been in the news in the last few months or so, and he was born a year before Abraham Lincoln, and down near Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Actually, the little community that he was born in was called Davisburg, and I'm sure it must have been named after some of his family ancestors. And then the third one, it happened to be the oldest of these three gentlemen, was Robert Anderson. And I always like to point out here that the Civil War began a fight between three Kentuckians, because these guys were all fellow Kentuckians. So literally, as you are at December 1860, the 26th, we have these three men in positions that are very, very crucial to what's about to happen throughout the rest of the United States. You have a map of the Charleston Harbor area on the back of your handout. Just thought that might be something that you would find interesting as you think about it. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Charleston. If you've never been there, I would encourage you to go. Charleston is certainly a very interesting place. What remains of Fort Sumter is still there. You can take a boat trip out to the fort, and it's definitely worthwhile if you're in that area or looking for a nice place to take a trip. I would encourage you to do that. It's interesting that, as I mentioned, Richard Clough Anderson, Robert Anderson's father, was stationed there at Fort Moultrie during the Revolutionary War. Robert Anderson was actually there in about, I think it was about the 1830s, and there was another young man that we're going to hear about in a moment, Lieutenant William T. Sherman, that was there with him. And as the ships would come in from New England and the northeast part of the United States, they would toss their ballast that they had used for the shipment in the site where Fort Sumter sits today. That was totally a man-made base for that fort, and those two gentlemen were actually there a long time before the Civil War and watched that as the ships would come in. And then, of course, as we know, in 1860, Robert Anderson's back there again. So now he's actually in Fort Sumter. He's battened down. Of course, he's getting demands from initially the South Carolina government, and then, of course, in the early part of 1861, from the newly created Confederate government to surrender, to vacate Fort Sumter. And Robert Anderson found himself basically sitting in a vacuum. He continued to send messages back and forth to Washington, to the War Department, and got very little response. So he basically sat there and then tried to do the best that he could with what guidance he'd been given and hold out as long as he possibly could. Interestingly, just about a month or two before the attack on Fort Sumter took place, this gentleman was assigned as the overall commander of Confederate and South Carolina forces in the Charleston area. And if you're not familiar with him by looking at his picture, he's the same PGD Beauregard who had been a cadet under Anderson's tutelage back at West Point. Now, you have Robert Anderson, basically the primary U.S. government military representative sitting in Fort Sumter, and one of his former cadets who had great respect for him is in charge of all the artillery surrounding Fort Sumter. When you learn about these kind of interpersonal connections between the Civil War, it really brings home what a tragedy this war was for those who had known each other and served together in the Army, and for the entire nation. These were the men who were serving as officers there with Robert Anderson. You probably have not heard of very many of them. The only one would perhaps be the one on the front left row. That's Abner Doubleday, who for many years it was believed was the father of baseball, but I think that's been subsequently disproved that he didn't actually create the game of baseball. But the one just to his left, or our right, is Robert Anderson, the commander. And the other officers there are either artillery officers, the surgeon, or fortification engineers. And those were the officers that were there serving with him. Notice the back row, the middle guy in the middle, his name is Lieutenant Jefferson C. Davis. No kin to the President Jefferson Davis, who was the President of the Confederacy. And he actually killed a Union general in 1862, William Bull Nelson. I don't know if you've heard that story. But these two got into it, and Davis went and got a gun and killed General Nelson, was placed under arrest, and then they released him, and he was never court-martialed or brought to charges, and eventually returned to active duty. So I don't really know, I don't understand all that went on with that, but it's So that just want to point out, he's not in any blood relation to the President of the Confederacy. This picture of Fort Sumter as it was before Anderson and his men occupied it, as I mentioned, it's a 3-story constructed fortification. It was designed to have over 200 men and a large number of artillery pieces, and again, primary purpose would have been to protect Charleston Harbor against attack by seaborne forces coming in from the ocean, from the Atlantic Ocean area. As I mentioned, they moved to this fort on December 26th during the cover of night. There were certainly nowhere near 200 men. We're talking more about the area of 55 to 60 actual Army officers and men, and some civilian workmen that had been out there trying to get this fort ready for use. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of demands that went back and forth between South Carolina forces and then the Confederate government demanding that the fort be surrendered. They wanted the federal presence in Charleston Harbor to go away. Robert Anderson was not going to do that. And initially, of course, when President Buchanan was in office before President Lincoln took office in March of 1861, he basically wanted his term to run out so he could go home and just not have to fool with it. So he basically didn't do anything. And then President Lincoln took office in March, and of course, as you well know, in April 12th, about 3 o'clock in the morning, finally the command was given for artillery fire to begin against Fort Sumter. And as you see here, it continued for 34 hours. Initially, when the fire was coming in from the South Carolina and Confederate artillery pieces, the Fort Sumter guns did not fire back, but then they did actually begin to fire back. And there was no one killed during this exchange of artillery fire. There was some very minor injuries, but eventually the damage against Fort Sumter, and of course we don't have any photographs, but this is an artist's conception of what it looked like. It certainly suffered great damage. All the buildings inside the fort were wooden, the barracks and those kind of facilities. So of course they caught fire from the hot shot that was sent in, and eventually it was very obvious to Robert Anderson that he really couldn't hold out anymore. If he did, probably was going to mean the entire destruction of his command. So he actually sent back a message to General Beauregard saying that he would accept terms that had been offered earlier and would surrender the fort. When he did that, in discussion back and forth between General Beauregard and Major Anderson, Anderson requested permission to fire 100 rounds to salute the United States flag as it was taken down. And they were given permission to do that by the Confederate General Beauregard. And as they did that, they got to the 50th round and the cannon exploded. It mortally wounded one of the artillerymen and seriously wounded 2 of them. The one who died was actually buried there in the grounds at the center of Fort Sumter. The other 2 were evacuated to Charleston. I've always found it very poignant that the very round on which the cannon exploded was the 50th, sort of portending the future fact that we would have 50 states in the United States of America. That's probably not it at all, but I think it's kind of an interesting number that the disaster occurred. And then subsequently, Anderson and his command were evacuated by a federal ship back to New York City. They had taken the flag down. The flag was folded up and was placed in a mail pouch. And Robert Anderson retained possession of that flag throughout the Civil War. And when they got back to New York City, Robert Anderson and his men were treated as national heroes because of all that had gone on from December until the final surrender of the fort and the taking down of the flag. As the Civil War then, of course, really began with a vengeance, President Lincoln made a call for many regiments to be raised to, as he put his directive, to suppress the rebellion that was going on. One of the things that was very curious, and I won't go into detail, but Kentucky was a sort of a unique state as this Civil War began. Initially, the state government didn't want to get involved. Uriah McGoffin, who was governor, I think actually wanted the state to secede. And for a period of time, the state of Kentucky declared neutrality. In May through September of 1861, Kentucky legislature declared neutrality. They would neither support or send men or supplies to the north or the south. So this created a real problem because the federal government under Abraham Lincoln was They were trying to raise troops and get their cannons and rifles and supplies. Of course, the Confederate government was trying to do the same thing. And Kentucky basically said, we're not going to get involved. We're going to stay out of it. So as the Lincoln administration looked around, they realized that Anderson, being a native Kentuckian and a very popular national figure, would be the ideal person placed in charge of the military preparations and operations here in Kentucky. So going from the rank of major, he was promoted to brigadier general, and initially, because of the neutrality of Kentucky, he couldn't actually have his offices inside the state, as he would subsequently. As you see there at the bottom, they eventually did move their headquarters to Louisville, but initially his headquarters was located up in Cincinnati, and then when neutrality ended in September of 1861, he was able to move his headquarters actually over into the central part of Louisville. Robert Anderson, unfortunately, I think, was suffering still after all these years from the injuries he suffered in the Mexican War. I don't think we have a real appreciation of the stress that he found himself under as the commander at Fort Sumter. As I said, he wasn't getting a lot of real written support or verbal support. Obviously there was no such thing as a telephone or radio or even a telegraph at Fort Sumter. And so unfortunately it took a real toll on him. One of the things that occurred was as the Civil War was obviously starting, they were making preparations in the east, in Virginia and the D.C. area, and they were making preparations out in Missouri and that area. But with the neutrality of Kentucky, there was nothing going on here. So when finally Anderson was placed in charge of Union forces here in Kentucky, he found it very difficult to get anything. Men and supplies and equipment were very scarce and very hard to come by. And so actually, I think it led to basically a nervous breakdown on his part. And even though he did serve in this commander position with the Union forces here in Kentucky for a period of time, on October 8th of 1861, he requested that he be allowed to step down from his command, and that permission was granted. I think those in the War Department probably realized that he had been in a very difficult position, and those that perhaps had talked with him realized that his nerves had really taken a beating from the Fort Sumter experience. And if you remember, back in the 1830s, he'd been stationed at Fort Moultrie with W.T. Sherman. Well, he had brought William T. Sherman as his deputy commander to the Department of Kentucky, and so he was actually named to replace Anderson when he stepped down from the command in October 1861. Throughout most of the rest of the Civil War, Anderson remained relatively inactive. He was the commander, as you see there, of Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island for a very short period of time, but pretty much I think he went back to New York City, and he really wasn't in the psychological or mental state to take the field and serve as an active commander, which is certainly unfortunate. The Civil War, of course, continued until the forces of General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to those under the command of General U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the Civil War was over. Fort Sumter had actually taken a continued and serious beating throughout the Civil War. I actually saw some photos just recently. I don't know if you saw that on the History Channel, the series where they had colorized many of the images taken during the Civil War, and there were images of Fort Sumter that I had never seen, but it was basically a pile of rubble at the end of the Civil War. I'm going to show you, not a very high quality, but a picture in just a moment. The Union Navy had bombarded it, and it was in pretty bad shape, but it had returned to the command and control of Union forces in the early part of 1865. So, with the end of the Civil War coming, the Secretary of War wanted to have the flag that had been taken down on April 14, 1861, returned to Fort Sumter and raised over the fort again. If you remember, I said that Robert Anderson had retained possession of that flag, and he still had it. He did not plan to attend this celebration or this commemoration. I think partly because he was a very private man. I think he didn't desire the public recognition or celebrity, and he felt that his service to the country in that respect was over, but Secretary of War asked that he be there, and so being the loyal soldier that he was, as we used to say in the Air Force, he saluted smartly and said, "Yes, sir, I'll be there, and I'll do that." And so, in fact, he returned to Fort Sumter on April 14, 1865. He was asked to speak, and I want to just share with you, this is an actual picture of the flag as it looked when it was taken down. If you make a trip to Charleston, South Carolina today, if you want to make a trip out to the fort, there's actually a visitor center on the shore there, and you can see this flag on display there in the visitor center for Fort Sumter. But this was a flag, and you can see where the battle damage had been experienced from the shot that had gone through it. So it was a very, very large, thousands of people made their way out to Fort Sumter for this. And this is what Robert Anderson said in his comments. He said, "I am here, my friends, my fellow citizens and fellow soldiers, to perform an act of duty to my country dear to my heart, and which all of you will appreciate and feel. Had I observed the wishes of my heart, it should have been done in silence. But in accordance with the request of the Honorable Secretary of War, I make a few remarks as by his order after 4 long years of war, I restored its proper place this dear flag, which floated here during peace before the first act of this cruel rebellion." Now, by this point, earlier that year, he'd been promoted to Major General, brevet Major General, but he was in such weak health that once the flag had been attached to the halyard to pull it back to the top of the pole, he was not strong enough to do that. So 3 soldiers helped him to pull the flag back up. And you can't really tell much about the condition. This is obviously a drawing, but a little bit of the destruction that had occurred to the walls and the facilities of the fort during the Civil War. That night, a banquet was held in downtown Charleston in the Charleston Hotel, which is no longer in existence today. This is a picture of the Charleston Hotel on the right there. And it was a long evening. There were many toasts made. Several of the noted people of the federal government during the Civil War spoke. And because of who he was and what he had done, Major General Robert Anderson was asked to make a toast at the very end of the evening. And if you'll notice here, I kind of steal my own thunder because I want to share his comments with you. But historians have determined that at this very late part of the evening, it was probably around 10:20 or so in the evening, when Robert Anderson stood to toast President Abraham Lincoln, it was almost the exact moment that John Wilkes Booth fired the shot that took President Lincoln's life. This is the comment that Anderson made. Of course, none of these people knew what was happening in Washington, D.C. at Ford's Theater. But he said, "Abraham Lincoln," as he was lifting his glass in toast, "I beg you now that you will join me in drinking to the health of another man whom we all love to honor, the man who, when elected President of the United States, was compelled to reach the seat of government with an escort, but who now can travel all over our country with means of hands and hearts to sustain him. I give you the good, the great, the honest man, Abraham Lincoln." As I say, of course, none of them present at that banquet could have known what was happening, apparently at very nearly the same moment. Well, after the war was over, Robert Anderson did pretty much retire to private life. He was in such bad health that he went to France and to try to regain his health. And unfortunately, he passed away on 27 October 1871 in France. The U.S. ship Guerriere returned his body to this country after the French government had given honors to his remains, and then he was returned to the United States Military Academy, where he was buried in the cemetery there. And I'll show you a photo of that in just a moment. To our knowledge, Robert Anderson has no known descendants living today. To point out, he did have 4 children, but don't believe any of them had children, and there's not known to be anybody that is directly descended from him. That happens to also be the case with President Lincoln. The only of those 3 men that I mentioned who has living descendants today is Jefferson Davis. He actually has descendants, I believe, that live in Colorado who descended from him. This is the gravestone that marks Robert Anderson's gravesite at the U.S. Military Academy Cemetery. I think it's very interesting if you notice, it obviously has all the details of his birth date, his death date, but notice on the very top of that catafalque, or whatever that particular kind of cemetery stone is called, a very exemplary symbols of his life. Notice that the Christian cross is prone there on the very top of it, and then an artillery ball is on the top. That was literally what he spent his entire, pretty much, Army career doing, was as an artilleryman. His wife, as I mentioned, who was pretty much an invalid throughout their married life, actually outlived him, and she only passed away, as you see there, in 1905. So that was 100 years after Robert Anderson had been born in 1805. She is buried at another site there at the U.S. Military Academy Cemetery as well. Let me just summarize by saying again that Robert Anderson was the son of Virginia. His father was a native Virginian, and of course Anderson, as I mentioned, was born here in Kentucky, so he's a native Kentuckian. He was certainly a soldier. And there were two interesting things that I discovered about him as I've been doing the research over the last 5 years. One of those, as I mentioned, was that he played a very important role in the creation of the U.S. Soldiers and Sailors Home, which still is in existence and operation in the Washington, D.C. area today. His role in having that established was so key that there was a cottage there. This was actually an estate that was taken over by the federal government or bought by the federal government. And the primary cottage in it was initially named the Anderson Cottage in honor of Robert Anderson and his efforts to try to get this kind of a place established for veterans of the U.S. Government. One of the other interesting things that I discovered was that in 1869, Robert Anderson and a group of other West Point graduates met in New York City, and they created what was known as the U.S. Military Academy Association of Graduates. Well, I thought, well, that's pretty neat. You know, we have a similar type organization for the U.S. Air Force Academy, folks that have graduated, and, you know, it's an alumni association, basically. But then after I took another thought about it, I realized that the motivation for creation of this Association of Graduates was not just to bind together those that had graduated from that U.S. Military Academy, but it was to heal the wounds that the Civil War had caused to all those that had graduated from there that had fought on opposite sides of the battlefield. It really struck me when I realized that, you know, that was certainly Robert Anderson's motivation, as it was those that were there with him. And interestingly, he's actually noted in the U.S. Military Academy Alumni Directory as the father of their association graduates. So I thought that was very special, that his entire life he spent that sort of effort. And then, of course, I think it's very obvious he was obviously an American. Very special individual, and someone that I've been really proud to have done research on and learned a lot about. And I hope you've learned a little bit about this man, other than the fact that, yeah, he was the commander at Fort Sumter and in a very tough spot. But they spent his entire life serving this country as a military officer and soldier. Now, I've given all of you a handout. If you didn't get one, there's copies over here. And if there's someone you know that might be interested in reading about all this, grab some copies. I want to point out particularly the books at the top are basically books that you might find. I haven't checked the card catalog. I don't know if they're in this library, but you could request them on interlibrary loan if you don't have here at the Boone County branch. The others, as you note at the bottom, are on Google Books, and you can actually go on your computer or iPad and download those. And some of these are books that were written by people that were alive during this time frame of all that we talked about tonight. So the list I've given you is a little bit more extensive, and I hope that'll be of help to you if you have any further interest in reading more about this. There's my email address. I always say at these talks that if you're like me, you'll come up with some questions tomorrow, and I won't be here, you probably won't either. But my email address is donrightmeyer@yahoo.com. If you have questions, if there's something that comes to your mind, send me an email. I'll be more than glad to try to get back in touch with you. I appreciate all of you being here tonight, and thank you very much for inviting me to Boone County to share with you about Major Robert Anderson. Thank you.